Доброго дня, шановні пані та панове.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. UCMC continues its work, and the topic of the next press briefing is playing in accordance with the rule whether Ukraine is ready to the next wave of coronavirus. I give the floor to the moderator of the event, Oleksandra Matviychuk, head of the board of Civil Freedom Center. Good afternoon, dear audience. I'm glad to welcome you here at this press conference that is organized by the Center for Civil Liberties. Today we present the report that was created together with several other civil rights organizations to fight coronavirus and to provide the results of the monitoring that was carried out for several months, and whether the legal framework was adhered to in connection with the limitations introduced because of coronavirus. We will speak not only about the past, but also about the future, whether Ukraine is ready for the second wave and what should be changed immediately in order that the problems that we identified in our report be resolved. And we have many speakers. They are really interesting, and I will give them the floor. I would like to say that during our press conference, we would like to touch upon three main blocks of questions. We will speak first about legal framework of introducing coronavirus limitations, and also second block is human rights that were violated, and we will speak about proportionality of these limitations and the problems that are seen by experts, and also regional prospects and the situation in the regions. So the number of speakers will join and will tell about the opinion of local civil governance. I would like to give the floor to Dmytro Koval, international lawyer, expert of human rights agenda. He helped to create this report. I would like to say that we know it happened so during pandemic in Ukraine. Political decisions, they became more important than healthcare, and the resolution at the level of the government was introduced that limited the rights and freedoms of people. And here we face a problem, because in accordance with constitution, freedoms and liberties of people cannot be limited at the level of such acts. So from one side, we understand that it is important to introduce the majority of these limitations, but at the same time, this was done not correctly, not in a legal way. And it forces us to think how other countries resolve these issues. And this report that was provided, it shows that there were some legal instruments used by different countries, and what Ukraine can get as an example in order to overcome this legal trap. Thank you, Oleksandra. I would like to remind how this regime was introduced, these quarantine measures. This was done through the law, and all the limitations that we know from they were introduced in accordance with this law to protect people from the infectious disease. And norm of Article 64 was violated, that rights should not be limited by bylaws. Only emergency state allows such limitations, and it was not introduced in Ukraine. So the response of other countries, whether they face the same trap, such as some countries face the situation and they overcame the situation. 3 or 4 countries in Europe, they also violated the constitutional norm, and they narrowed the norms, and it is not directly envisaged by constitution, but other countries overcame situation in a better way, and their response to COVID didn't contradict the constitution, and their instruments, they established mechanisms that were envisaged by constitution, and there is a clear difference between Ukraine and other countries. They had the more flexible forms in constitution concerning human rights. They have more diversified states, how to respond to the big crisis. We have military and emergency state, and they have more conditions like this, and they were able to formulate the new quarantine rules better without violating constitution. And in the framework of some alternative and allowed procedures, they limited the rights of people, but in the framework of constitution. And some countries provided more adequate response and preserved the supremacy of law. They had more flexible norms. They had norms that are better prepared for the crisis we face. And the last I want to say in connection with this is that in the countries where they didn't form the value of the law, of the right, outside of the scope of the first implementation of the law, and in Ukraine, the provisions of Article 64 were not adhered to, and there may be far consequences of this. And no people in this country, no person in this country would like to see those consequences in the future. And the measures taken by the central power of Ukraine, they face opposition at the local level. And one of the reasons for this is that from the very start, the measures that were introduced as limiting measures, they were not properly linked to constitution. And there were some contradictions with constitution, and it created some mistrust, some skepticism concerning the decisions of the central power. And I believe that in the countries where the law is understood as a value, and this idea appeared before it appeared in Ukraine, and they understand that they should adhere to constitution, and even in case of such big crises. And it is impossible to go outside the framework of constitution and rights that are established by other laws. They understand that the non-implementation of constitution, non-implementation of basic law may bring even worse results that we may foresee in the future. Thank you, Dmytro. I remember our feelings, our team in the center when pandemic started and some limitations were introduced. I had the feeling that coronavirus is like a fuel that was put in some extinguishing fires, and there are systemic problems that we faced before coronavirus and concerning human rights, and then they became active. They started to provide fire, and legal acts were needed, and practical actions should be implemented. And what human rights are more infringed, and what the state should do, because it didn't do this, in order to resolve this issue. I would like to give the floor to one of the authors of this report, Yevhen Zakharov, human rights defender, director of Kharkiv Human Rights Group. Thank you, Lesia.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to make a comment about the previous speech. In many cases, in the formulation as to the constitution, there is a second part which goes about the limitation of the laws and the rights. According to the laws should be amended. as to mobility freedom, religion freedom, other laws on the civil rights, in order to take into consideration those collisions which we now face with the norms of the law, we should address the situation. The only right which has not been in the Constitution limited. This is the right, the liberty of meetings, rallies. This is the court which should decide on the limitations of this right. So legislative framework, there was a constitutional court decision ruling, and the law on the freedom of meetings, of assembly. This law was not considered in the constitutional court. It was rejected. So now we can bring it again to the constitutional court. We should submit it there. It is important that the limitations, restrictions were imposed not by the law but by the cabinet. Constitution says that if we go this way via constitutional court, then the situation, the mortal state can be introduced, martial state. The story is much longer, but the best way will be to amend the profile laws which concern those rights which are limited during the pandemic. But this quarantine measures and everything should be taken into consideration at the legislative level without martial state. I would like to mention one more area which was affected by the pandemic. If in all countries of the world, in fact, the healthcare systems failed, this challenge was too strong. I would not comment, but I'd like to mention that the system of healthcare in prisons, it has been broken down completely. It failed. Today we have the situation in this penitentiary system where 28,000 personnel members work and 53,000 prisoners are kept. In this system, some certain links, they have no coronavirus because the Center of Public Health Information with the Ministry of Healthcare, they say that about 65 cases of coronavirus were proved, including only 5 prisoners and 60, while the other 60%, they are personnel and medical staff of these prisons. This is due to low rate of testing, and this is connected with this healthcare system in penitentiary area. They are incapable to address this pandemic. Even those measures which were taken by the health center of the Ministry of Interior, yes, they are reasonable and compliant with the situation and the laws, but they do not help. We monitor the situation and we see that the personnel does not comply in prisons, doesn't comply with individual protection means requirements. They do not use masks. And regulatory documents, the regulations, they do not envisage giving this individual protection means to prisoners and detained persons. These figures which I quoted, they show that the prisoners, they are not tested. That is why Ukrainian prisons, they have no coronavirus, but this is because prisoners are not tested. We can only say that the prisoners have no contacts with relatives, but now this is back, and in some institutions persons are searched without compliance with medical sanitary protection norms. Those persons who were really sick, finally they have been moved to the profile institution, medical institution, but many other sick people, they did not get medical aid, which they were to get this medical aid according to the law, because they were not moved to the profiled medical institutions. This proves that the situation in the penitentiary system, the situation in prisons is threatening to all personnel members and to prisoners as well. And recent information that this or that prison has some outbreaks of coronavirus, they really give rise to concerns. I am concerned, in fact. The penitentiary healthcare system cannot be detached from general healthcare system. This issue should be addressed, and the prison medical staff, they should be included into this healthcare system. The right for medical aid which people have wherever they are, free, whether they are free or they are imprisoned. But now the situation is different in Ukraine. Thank you very much, Mr. Yevhen Zakharov. If we look at the structure of penitentiary institutions in Ukraine, WHO requirements, they are not complied, and there are no conditions for compliance because people have no chance to wash hands with soap because they have no these amenities in the rooms. So there are so many people there, and we should take care of their health. I now remember one joke that was it was invented in the mid of the pandemic. The second wave of coronavirus will not come to Ukraine because the first wave will never end. We now invite to the mic the Dmytro Lufer, advisor to the Prime Minister. Mr. Lufer, you are welcome. Can you tell us what is now happening in the preparation to the second wave, how the lessons learned have been taken into consideration, and what will you do not to restrict the liberties, civil rights of people, and what are the priority problems. For example, penitentiary system is a vivid example. The government should take this issue and place it in the agenda. Yes, the problem is comprehensive. Most of what has already been said today, this problem is new, novel, and the world has never faced something similar. Even previous influenza epidemics, they were by scale of much shorter. So Ukraine was among the countries which were looking for the way out, like other countries. The decisions were to be taken fast. Ukraine is one of the first countries which started complete lockdown. And this gave us time to prepare the healthcare system. So we did much in the medical institutions. Maybe we could have done something faster and better. But now the information from the medical care system, it shows us that we succeeded. The healthcare system, its capacity is very important, and quarantine and all the and its response to the number of ill people, sick people, are of importance. Continuously new changes are introduced. On the very beginning it was difficult, but when the restrictions, when the lockdown was finished, and we did not know always how this disease is transmitted, and this adds to complication of the situation. So the changes are introduced continuously. As concerns the legal framework, it is difficult for me to comment because these restrictions, they were introduced in many other countries as well. Yes, legislative framework should be also amended to these political decisions which were taken. So the changes should be introduced more frequently. It seems to me that there's some stability in the amendments now may be seen, because we see now that there is a mode that we have the areas of danger, and now this is the right time to introduce amendments to the legislative framework. Whether the government will do this, this is a question to the parliament, not to the government. The government can initiate, but the parliament should legislate these amendments. So the government will submit these amendments to the parliament, but the parliament should approve them. And this is now impossible because the session is not now on the way in the parliament. Coronavirus pandemic will be with us for a long time until the vaccine would be available. This means that there is sense to regulate the legislative framework, to amend it, and not only limitations of the mobility right, other rights were restricted. This is access to the information about individuals' health. For example, the information that the person is sick, it should be accessible, because this is of importance for self-isolation or for not transmitting the disease. This issue should be regulated legislatively, because there are many bodies of power which needs this information about individuals' health in order that they respond adequately to these cases of illness, and they will be then addressing those people who were in contact with the sick person. And now we are looking how to find the ways to identify the people who were in contact with sick people. Now I would like to give the floor to Ms. Galan. She is coordinator of the Center for Civil Liberties. I have the following question. We have got information from mass media that several millions will be allocated for shooting a movie about the National Guard activities during pandemic of coronavirus. If you were the author of this movie, what would you shoot? Which communications between the state enforcement officers and individuals, what would you show? How law enforcement staff behaved during the quarantine? Oh, now I feel as if I'm a scriptwriter or a director of movie. Well, at the beginning of quarantine, together with volunteers, Ozone NGO, we observed the process of quarantine and law enforcement officers' behavior. First, we collected information from social media. Unfortunately, we have no access to some court sittings, so we focus on public sources of information. And we would like to thank our volunteers who sent us information. They are hundreds. So, talking nationwide, we should speak honestly. And frankly speaking, the boom of violations which we registered, which we recorded, they were in the first months of lockdown. That lockdown was total, and law enforcement officers and law enforcement bodies, for example, National Guard or other public order organizations, they were to work in the conditions of quarantine. So there was the boom of unreasonable actions and violations in the first months of quarantine. There were interventions in the civil rights and the right of free assembly, freedom of assembly was violated, but the issues are controversial. Even civil rights advocates who analyze, they say that this is controversial. We have hundreds of videos and pictures where we heard motivations, explanations on the part of enforcement officers. We saw the other problem. I would like to thank Dmytro Koval, an expert who strengthened us he helped us to formulate, to articulate the issue. This is the issue of communication. The communication was one of the priority problem in the relationship power bodies to other authorities and to individuals. So we observed how the restrictions were imposed and complied. Sometimes enforcement officers did not understand the resolutions issued, and there was a lack of communication, and there were some unreasonable actions. For example, when one person, one individual was against 20 policemen without social distance, and this person was issued a fine. The same concerned other issues when fines were issued to drivers without social distance kept by policemen. So the practices and the lack of communication, they brought to the lack of confidence in the restrictions in this resolution, and now people do not understand why do they need these restrictions, because in many cases law enforcement officers acted unreasonably and inadequately. So improvements are needed, and as Oleksandra said, the problem should be also addressed, which we mentioned in the regions which we visited. No. These restrictions, they were not well formulated, not well articulated, and now for law enforcement officers, their patrolling was difficult because there is a need to issue some regulations and recommendations for law enforcement officers, some methodologies, how law enforcement officers should behave, and the most we are most concerned with the health of law enforcement officers themselves. In the first days, when there was a lack of masks, lack of antiseptic liquids for personnel, we mentioned this in our reports. We can say that official reports shows not true figures. We got comments from the police officers themselves. There was a problem. There were no masks in law enforcement authorities. Volunteers provided masks to policemen so that they do not risk their health. So answering whether Ukraine is ready to the second wave of coronavirus, I would like to say that we need the Ministry of Interior and police to be more proactive, to take proactive actions. And together with the cabinet, they should implement all the regulations, because now people relax, people are on vacations, but the second wave is now near our doors, because we have anti-record high figures of coronavirus cases. The mobility is very high, record high, so we should cooperate to get prepared to the second wave. so that we do not have conflict, we do not have so large lack of confidence as we had during the first wave. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this optimistic ending. There were some problems with communication, and I must say that these problems remain. Quarantine was introduced, and without any communication, they closed contact line, and people, for several months, they got stuck. They could not go to the occupied territory of Donbass or from that territory, and there were terrible queues, and there were people. They were in winter clothes, and they didn't have seasonal clothes, and they lacked housing. They could not go home, and without any communication, administrative border with Crimea was closed, and the families were divided. Those who went to vacation there, and students, they were asked to come to the mainland Ukraine to study, but now they understand that until the end of the month they won't be able to come here. And this is about human rights. This does not correspond to standards, and there is lack of communication. So people provide their comments about this communication. The Minister of Cabinet of Ministers, he provides this decision about the closure of checkpoint for Crimea, and comments of people, what they say, what they think about communication, what they think about the minister, what they think about his decision on the whole. So this problem remains, as we see. It is not properly thought through by the government. The situation improves concerning checkpoint with Crimea, but this is done post factum. This is not a well thought through decision with prior communication with the citizens. So we've started to speak about the regions. We've started from the occupied territories, and I would like to give the floor to Andriy Moskalenko, Deputy Head of Lviv, concerning issues of development, to speak about the quarantine and what were the biggest challenges for the power to find this balance between protection of human rights and security. And this is about preservation of healthcare and even lives of thousands of residents of Lviv. Dear colleagues, good afternoon. Greetings from Lviv. Thank you for this opportunity to join to this very important dialogue. I would like to say that measures that were introduced and are introduced from the start of quarantine, they were really necessary. We understand the aim to prepare the healthcare system to minimize the number of contacts that were in the first stage of the spread of coronavirus. We understand, for example, in Lviv, we saw what we previously saw in the horror movies, when cars go through empty cities, ask people to stay home. And for people, it was difficult psychologically to face such a situation. And now we are in the 6 months, and we understand that this story may be with us for a long time. And we should learn how to live in this situation. And I would like to speak about 3 aspects. First, the limitations and closures, they were really forced, they were necessary. And this issue of human rights, it should be under control, because there are limitations that are necessary, but undercover there may be some limitations that are not so necessary. There should be proper compensation for businesses, because for some people this is their main income. And when we limit some entrepreneurial activity based on the decisions of the government, we adopted a special program to reprofile the business, to provide certificates, and if this is for loan, to help them with a percentage, with the rates of the loans. And about the cultural sector. Cultural institutions were closed for 4 months, and they were not able to earn from performances, some concerts, and we started a program, Express Support of Culture. We paid several grants, 50,000 hryvnias, through competition. Decisions were taken quickly during 1 week to support the sector. So if we have some limitations, we should compensate. If we are speaking about the city, 300,000 were not obtained by the budget, and there are some limitations, but we understand that part of the business, they do not have opportunity to pay taxes because they do not have income. And the city paid a lot. For example, 900 doctors, they get some additional payment from the budget of the city. Also about the zoning. And there was a meeting of the commission yesterday, and Lviv is in orange, remains in orange zone. We accepted this decision. For the last 5 months, we have been living in this orange zone. There is no planned hospitalization, no camps for children, and if we are speaking about orange zone, sport halls should be closed, and we monitored them before the decision was taken at the state level. For 200 or 300 meters, for example, only several people are in the hall. Why should we close it? There are other institutions that pose bigger threat. I cannot bring comparisons, but such things appear. At the local level, we understand that in Lviv there are 5 or 7 networks, and they read the decision of the government and they have questions about this. For example, they pay some minimal salaries and they understand that there won't be any compensation. We accepted the decision, but those institutions, they should not be closed because this is based on common sense, and we take responsibility for this. And we should base our decision on logic, and we should speak with those people about whom we take this decision. For the first 1.5 months of quarantine, after survey carried out by one mobile operator, big data, this survey showed that Lviv residents that adhered to the quarantine the best. The majority of people didn't leave their flats during the day and at night, and the indicators were nearly nearly identical during the day and during the night. It is not correct to compare the cities, but in Lviv there are many institutions that adhere to quarantine. And I won't speak about technical details, but even those people who established rules, they didn't come to this high level like these people did. And if we have rules, they should be equal for everyone, and if there is a mask regime, it should be everywhere. Residents of Lviv, they go to other cities and they see that the situation is different, that it is allowed to act differently at different places, and why can they do the same? So there is a lot of information, and the situation is difficult. Coronavirus is spreading. We should balance between economy and healthcare, because doctors, they give themselves fully to save the situation. We should find a balance. And the justice, if we may say so, it should be preserved. It should be provided. So I would like to say in conclusion that in the first months and now, due to the city volunteers, entrepreneurs, doctors, this is the time that has shown that we may have synergy and take proper decisions. When some institutions opened, we spoke with cultural institutions, each centimeter, and with catering institutions, we also spoke how many times janitor should go to clean the toilet, and then it will work. If for example, I say that you do not adhere, but the institution should provide for safety. And when there was first day of work for cafes, they reopened for indoor catering, and one popular cafe was closed the same day. And we believe that people will be not satisfied by this, but people said that we would like to have safety. We should adhere to the rules. No one should deviate from the rules. Thank you. Thank you, Andriy. And we are going to continue about regional situation. We followed information war between the center and separate regions that were introduced in the red zone. In accordance with the rules of adaptive quarantine, in accordance with criteria provided by the government, they rejected the decisions of the central power. And this raises the issue about the strategy, how to fight coronavirus pandemic, and whether to provide more for the more trust to central government or local authorities, because they know the situation at the grassroots level. So I would like to speak, to give the floor to Ruslan Rokhov, expert on this decentralization and the local self-governance, the founder of the School of Mayors. Thank you. I agree with my colleague that the beginning ruined the trust. There were some problems with implementation of legislation, and there was some mistrust concerning competence, whether mask regime is needed. Sanitary doctors say that masks, they do not protect, then they say that you should have them. Others say that you should have them only indoors. And conflicts appeared in the cities when they provided full lockdown, and they prohibited the work of even of food shops. And some city heads, they didn't adhere to sanitary doctors' decisions because there was some harm because of this. And during weekends, all the food stores were closed, and on Friday were huge queues. A lot of people, because artificially a situation was created for contacts and the spread of the virus. I won't mention the names of those mayors in order to prevent the conflict of local power and central government. And some mayors explained why they won't do this. They understood that the threat and harm would be more than if it is not introduced. So this is about healthcare and human rights. I really thank Deputy Head of Lviv. This is about healthcare and about well-being of population. And the last sociological survey carried out by a reading group, it shows that the respondents were asked, you personally, are you more afraid of the disease, or you're more afraid of economic consequences. 62% said that they more afraid of economic consequences, and only 29% said that this is a healthcare issue. In Ukraine, a lockdown started, and systemically at the state level, they started to limit economic activity and human rights, and many experts said that we should understand that this pandemic is full on. And I wrote a column, "This reign is full on," it was called, and we will live in such situation, and we should find a balance in order that those people who believe that everything should be closed because health is more important, and those who believe that we cannot close everything because we should earn. So we should find some balance, and the only alternative, experts believe, that to create such a system when people may earn without threat to their health. And local self-governance experts, they are in close communication with people, they see the situation clearly, they spoke with volunteers, with businessmen, and local self-governance, they better feel the ways, the sentiments, how to provide proper conditions to adhere to sanitary norms in order that coronavirus infection not be able to spread. And adaptive quarantine was provided locally, and limitations should be reasonable. And starting mid-May, adaptive quarantine started, and some parameters, some indicators were introduced if some territory shows increase or decrease. And we see the example of Lviv, for example, the situation in sport halls. I attended a sport hall yesterday. For example, there were 10 people and 200 square meters, and there are sanitizers, necessary PPE, and locally you may better see what can be done. It is difficult to think at the top level about all areas, and locally you may better see the situation, and we should provide the opportunities to local government to take decisions. This is about discretion and opportunities at a local level. And we entered the red zone, Lutsk and Ternopil, and they started to speak about stopping transport, closing kindergartens, and local government. They understand that people are vulnerable, they cannot provide for their families, someone should look after children. And if you do not go to work because you are obliged to be at home, who will feed me? So until now, this issue remains unresolved, and those measures of support, people were able not to pay a single social contribution, and some taxes were delayed. For example, you should feed yourself, you should pay salaries to your workers. If you fire them, or you may get bankrupt. And we see that in Europe and in US, there is huge support. In US, these are trillions of dollars of help. And we have a deficit budget, and the state is not able to provide money to everyone to support the well-being of the citizens. And through the prism of this aspect, we should carry out our discussion, and we should also ask the government to deal with it. They should understand that the government is not an opponent in the discourse. If we analyze the first steps concerning the fight against coronavirus spread, main money was provided from the local budget, and also a single tax. Local budgets didn't get, and then they suffered because of this. And in cooperation, And Andriy confirmed that the city heads, they consciously decrease the proceeds and they try to support the residents. So we should search not for sanctions and their implementation. So everyone follows Belarus events and adherence of legislation of Belarus concerning unsanctioned assemblies and the use force against the citizens. The same about quarantine measures in Ukraine. For example, we may find people to get the money for the budget, but the other thing is to form an atmosphere of wish to adhere to legislation, and law enforcement system influences the consciousness of the citizens. They explain to people what it will give, that the system takes care of people and does not threaten people. And we feel it in communication each time the citizens have contacts with law enforcement officers. So I would like to say that, unfortunately, we see that we have a spike, the spread. This is not only in Ukraine. We see that in the European Union on the whole, in separate countries, in Germany. It was an example before when they overcame the spike, but there is a new spike again. This is natural. Maybe for half a year or more until vaccine is introduced and the majority of population be protected from this infection, we will continue to live in this new situation. We should not limit the rights of people in violation of constitution, and we should help our citizens to support their own well-being and the well-being of their families.
When I was listening to you, I remembered how the head of the government of Pakistan, he said that very sad phrase that we have a very good choice whether people will die of hunger or of coronavirus. So talking about economic issues as well as about human rights issues, these rights, they should be taken into consideration in the strategy of coronavirus fighting. So how we shall address the pandemic? Sometimes we see violations of human rights, but the government, local self-governments, and then foreign communities, they now observe the situation with human rights. For example, Freedom House monitors the situation of human rights violations. They have special questionnaire on human rights observation. I would like to give the floor to Matviychuk, Schaaf, Director of Freedom House Representative Office. Freedom House coordinates the platform dialogue, security dialogue. During the whole pandemic period, this platform worked to analyze and draft best recommendations for the government and self-government so that the safety is preserved and security is preserved. And we would like to give the floor to Mr. Matviychuk, Schaaf.
Oleksandra said we were very closely following the impact of the pandemic on human rights and democracy in Ukraine and many other countries, including the U.S. And it's, of course, everyone understands that the impact is quite significant. One of the issues or problems that we've noticed in Ukraine and elsewhere is the securitization of this issue of looking at how we're going to deal with the pandemic, how we're going to deal with the public health crisis from the security perspective, from the hard security perspective rather than from the human security perspective. What we're talking about is a crisis that is about a crisis that requires that that governments, that authorities, that people take new measures, implement new approaches to protect human beings, to protect their health, their psychological and physical health, their economic and financial well-being, the also cultural health and other aspects. And so, as Oleksandra said, we are working with Center for Civil Liberties and other organizations to strengthen dialogue between civil society organizations and activists and law enforcement and security agencies in Ukraine. And the reality is that the situation, the level of dialogue for many years has not been great because there are issues with these agencies not being reformed, issues with the security agencies not being open to engaging civil society, engaging human rights community, and we've made some important progress. But in that area, but when we have a crisis like this, and the first response is one of hard security in an environment where the security sector is not properly communicating with the public, is not properly engaging civil society and respecting human rights, then this challenge is even more difficult. And so I want to give some examples of some of the issues that we and our partners have observed across the country that I think both are indicative of the securitized approach to dealing with the pandemic, and also of a breakdown in dialogue among the authorities and law enforcement authorities, but also the public and civil society at large. Oleksandra mentioned the restrictions on access to Crimea and crossing the administrative boundary that were introduced without notice at all. And again, this has had a significant impact on the rights, the lives, the economic well-being of people who need to travel back and forth. There's been a similar challenge when it comes to crossing between government-controlled and non-government-controlled parts of Donbass, where there have been people who have been stuck in the gray zone for days, and it's not a safe place to be. And the policies keep changing, and the implementation of the policies depends on which checkpoint you're at and who is manning the checkpoint at that time. And then also on the local authorities. Where, for example, in Luhansk region, the local authorities were more quick to provide the self-isolation accommodation for people crossing the administrative boundary, whereas in Donetsk Oblast, with different regional authorities, they were much less quick, and as a result, more people were stuck in the middle. There have been numerous issues with freedom of expression and assembly, as Lyubov mentioned, with freedom of assembly, but also violations of press freedom at the regional level, and also access to information. So journalists have been unable to access court hearings, unable to get information from local authorities, including about pandemic, but also other things. And then there have been certainly abuses by law enforcement authorities and groups that are working with law enforcement authorities. So, for example, in some communities and cities, the police work closely with paramilitary groups like Municipal Varta and other groups that are not under civic control, and actually recent experience shows that they very much are not under the control of law enforcement authorities either, and have been responsible for racially motivated law enforcement or policing activities that are quite problematic. So what we're seeing is how this pandemic has exacerbated already unequal treatment of marginalized groups within society, whether it be elderly people, people without stable income or housing, people that rely on informal commerce in order to sustain themselves. And so these issues are not being adequately considered. They're not being adequately addressed. And so it was very informative to hear from local authorities who are very much experiencing, living through these challenges. But I think that there needs to be more thinking about how in strengthening the lines of communication among civil society and law enforcement and the authorities in general, and that so the security dialogue bezpeki is one potential opportunity for that at the regional level, to have everyone sitting behind the same table, to be raising, discussing, and coming up with solutions to some of these challenges. But also, there are other opportunities that need to be pursued, whether it be civic councils at the local level, at the national level, at the regional level. And it's important that these dialogues, these opportunities for cooperation are not unnecessarily restricted during this time. And we have noticed that it's more difficult to engage law enforcement in security sector right now. And oftentimes they won't join a Zoom call. And if it's impossible to meet in person, then it means that the communication that is essential is not happening. And so it's also important that civil society, that the authorities find ways to ensure that communication is continuing and is actually strengthening. The last thing I would want to mention is that, of course, there has been a lot of discussion about how there needs to be better communication, there needs to be better information. There's also a problem of disinformation that is quite common across the country and across the world. I know that, of course, this is a challenge before the pandemic, and it will be a challenge after the pandemic. There have been proposals and discussions on disinformation policies and laws in Ukraine, and actually, even in the absence of a specific law on this matter, disinformation has been pretty aggressively addressed under the existing laws. But what I would want to warn against is using this opportunity where disinformation is a problem to rush through or pass some stronger and potentially more problematic policy on disinformation. The proposals that had been considered earlier this year were quite draconian and would essentially involve the government in saying who is telling the truth and who isn't. And there are discussions about continuing to work in this area in the future. And of course, disinformation in the public health sphere is a major problem, but we need to be careful. And again, it's essential that the dialogue, the cooperation between the authorities, between policymakers and civil society, that is essential to a properly functioning democracy, continue despite pandemic circumstances. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Matthew for his comments. They are very important. What should be important in these times, which Ukraine is experiencing, as well as the whole world, talking about the future, as about the time which is going fast, because the second wave is next to our door, and as our speakers have already said, there is a record high number of sick people today. How much time do we have, and how can we use it efficiently to respond, to change our legislative framework and practices so that we overcome this crisis of the lack of confidence between society and authorities, so that we maintain balance between civil rights and security. I would like to focus your attention that in this report we provide recommendations. They are targeted recommendations. They were drafted by experts, profile experts. They drafted individual sections of this report. Ministry of Interior and High Court and other national authorities, they have provided recommendations in this report, and we do not want them to stay only on paper like the Constitution Article 64. It remains only on paper. So due to the restrictions related to coronavirus, we cannot have any questions to UCMC. I would like to thank the Ukraine Crisis Media Center for having provided us the premises and this chance to speak. And then we will finish our briefing. We will inform you, and we are waiting for the feedback from those national authorities who will address our recommendations in our report. Thank you.